Sometimes the most profound moments of human understanding happen not through words, but through silence. When assumptions crumble in an instant, when prejudice meets truth, when a single glance reveals more than 1,000 conversations ever could. This is the story of Colonel James Morrison, a decorated military officer who believed he had seen everything war could offer until he encountered Lieutenant Sarah Chun in a military courtroom in 2019. What started as a routine disciplinary hearing became a moment that would forever change how he viewed courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of serving one's country. In a world where first impressions often become lasting judgments, where authority figures make decisions based on incomplete information, this story reminds us that every person carries invisible battles, hidden scars, and untold stories of heroism. Sometimes it takes just one moment of revelation to transform our understanding of what strength really looks like. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Harrison's main administrative building as Colonel James Morrison adjusted his dress uniform one final time before entering Conference Room B. At 54, Morrison carried himself with the rigid precision that 32 years of military service had carved into his very bones. His silver hair was cut to regulation length, his shoes polished to mirror perfection, and his chest displayed ribbons that told the story of a man who had served his country through 3 different conflicts. Morrison had seen it all, or so he believed. He had commanded troops in the deserts of Iraq, navigated the political complexities of Afghanistan, and spent countless hours in military courtrooms dealing with personnel issues that range from minor infractions to serious breaches of military conduct. Today's hearing was supposed to be routine, just another case in a long line of disciplinary matters that seemed to define much of his administrative duties these days. The case file in his leather briefcase bore the name Lieutenant Sarah Chun, age 28, stationed at Fort Harrison for the past 18 months. According to the preliminary reports, Lieutenant Chun had been involved in what her commanding officer described as insubordination during a critical training exercise. The specifics were still unclear to Morrison, but the complaint suggested that Chun had refused direct orders from her superior officer during a simulated combat scenario, potentially putting other soldiers at risk. Morrison had reviewed dozens of similar cases over the years. Young officers, often overwhelmed by the pressure of military life, sometimes made poor decisions that required correction. Most of these cases were straightforward disciplinary matters that could be resolved with additional training, temporary reduction in privileges, or in more serious cases, formal reprimands that would follow an officer throughout their career. As he walked through the corridors of the administrative building, Morrison reflected on the changing nature of the military. When he had first joined the service in the early 1990s, the armed forces were predominantly male, and the culture reflected that reality. Over the decades, he had witnessed significant changes as more women entered combat roles, as policies evolved to become more inclusive, and as the military grappled with adapting its traditions to a more diverse force. Morrison prided himself on being fair and professional in all his dealings, regardless of an officer's gender, race, or background. He believed strongly in the military's core values of integrity, service, and excellence, and he expected every soldier under his command to uphold those same standards. However, like many officers of his generation, he sometimes struggled to understand what he perceived as the different challenges and perspectives that younger soldiers brought to military service. The conference room was already set up when Morrison arrived. Captain Williams, the prosecuting officer, was arranging his files at one end of the long oak table, while the court reporter checked her equipment. Morrison took his position at the head of the table, spreading out the case materials and reviewing the charges one more time. Lieutenant Chun was charged with willful disobedience of orders, conduct unbecoming an officer, and failure to maintain military bearing during a training exercise. According to the report filed by Major Thompson, Chun's direct supervisor, the incident occurred during a live-fire training exercise designed to simulate urban combat conditions. When ordered to lead her unit through a particular route that Thompson had designated as tactically sound, Chun had apparently stopped her advance, gathered her soldiers, and chosen an alternative path that deviated significantly from the planned exercise. Thompson's report indicated that Chin's decision had not only disrupted the training scenario, but had also created confusion among other units participating in the exercise. More seriously, Thompson suggested that Chin's actions demonstrated a lack of trust in her superior officers and could indicate problems with her ability to follow orders under pressure, qualities that were essential for any officer who might eventually find herself in actual combat situations. Morrison had worked with Major Thompson for several years and respected his judgment. Thompson was a competent officer with strong leadership skills and a good understanding of military tactics. If Thompson felt that Chin's behavior warranted disciplinary action, there was probably good reason for concern. The preliminary investigation had included interviews with several soldiers who had been present during the training exercise. Their statements were somewhat mixed, with some indicating that Chun had acted professionally throughout the incident, while others suggested that there had been visible tension between Chun and Major Thompson both before and after the disputed orders were given. Morrison was particularly interested in understanding the full context of Chin's decision-making process. Military training exercises were designed to be as realistic as possible while maintaining appropriate safety measures. Officers were expected to follow orders promptly and efficiently, but they were also trained to use their judgment when circumstances warranted deviation from standard procedures. The challenge in cases like this was determining whether an officer's decision to deviate represented sound tactical thinking or simple insubordination. At exactly 0900 hours, Captain Williams called the hearing to order. Morrison looked up from his files as the conference room door opened, expecting to see Lieutenant Chun enter with her appointed counsel. What he saw instead was a young woman in a perfectly pressed dress uniform, walking with a slight but noticeable limp that favored her left side. Her military bearing was impeccable, her posture straight and confident despite the physical irregularity in her gait. Lieutenant Chun was smaller than Morrison had expected, probably no more than 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back in regulation style, and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room as she entered. She moved with the precise, measured steps of someone who had learned to compensate for physical limitations while maintaining military standards of deportment. Behind Chun walked Captain Rodriguez, a military lawyer whom Morrison knew by reputation as a competent and thorough defense counsel. Rodriguez carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had successfully navigated many military legal proceedings, and his presence suggested that Chen's case might be more complex than the initial reports had indicated. As Chun took her seat across from Morrison, he found himself making the kind of quick assessments that years of military leadership had trained him to make. She appeared calm and composed, showing no obvious signs of nervousness or anxiety despite facing charges that could significantly impact her military career. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture professional, and her demeanor respectful but not submissive. Morrison had learned over the years that initial impressions during disciplinary hearings could be misleading. Some officers who appeared confident and composed were actually struggling with serious personal or professional issues, while others who seemed nervous or uncertain were simply dealing with the natural stress of formal military proceedings. The key was to look beyond surface appearances and focus on the facts and evidence that would emerge during the hearing. Captain Williams began by reading the formal charges and summarizing the events that had led to the disciplinary action. As he spoke, Morrison watched Chen's face for any reaction or indication of how she might respond to the accusations. She listened intently to every word, occasionally making brief notes on a legal pad, but her expression remained neutral and professional throughout Williams's presentation. The charges, as Williams outlined them, painted a picture of an officer who had failed to follow direct orders during a critical training exercise. According to the official version of events, Major Thompson had designated a specific route for Chen's unit to follow during the urban combat simulation, a route that had been carefully planned to achieve specific training objectives while maintaining appropriate safety protocols. When Chen received her orders, Williams explained, she had initially acknowledged them in the standard military fashion. However, As her unit approached the designated route, Chun had apparently called a halt to the advance, gathered her soldiers for what witnesses described as an impromptu consultation, and then proceeded to lead them along an entirely different path that took them away from the planned exercise area. Thompson had immediately attempted to contact Chun via radio to redirect her unit back to the original route, but according to the report, Chun had informed her superior officer that she was adjusting tactics based on field conditions and had continued along her chosen path. The exercise had ultimately been completed, but Thompson felt that Chen's actions had demonstrated a lack of military discipline and had set a poor example for the soldiers under her command. Morrison found himself formulating questions as Williams spoke. What exactly were the field conditions that Chun believed warranted changing the planned route? Had there been safety concerns that Thompson had not adequately considered? Was this a case of an inexperienced officer making poor decisions under pressure? Or was there more to the story than the initial report suggested? As Williams concluded his presentation, Morrison looked directly at Lieutenant Chun for the first time since the hearing had begun. Her eyes met his steadily, without challenge, but also without the deference that many junior officers displayed when facing senior commanders in formal settings. There was something in her gaze that Morrison found difficult to categorize, a quality that suggested depths of experience that seemed incongruous with her relatively junior rank and apparent youth. Captain Rodriguez stood to present Chen's initial response to the charges. He spoke with the measured cadence of an experienced military lawyer, acknowledging the seriousness of the allegations while indicating that Chen's actions had been based on legitimate tactical considerations that would become clear as the hearing proceeded. Colonel Morrison, Rodriguez said, Lieutenant Chun does not dispute that she changed the route of her unit during the training exercise in question. However, the evidence will show that her decision was based on tactical assessments that any competent officer would have made under similar circumstances. Moreover, the full context of the training exercise, including certain factors that were not included in Major Thompson's initial report, will demonstrate that Lieutenant Chen's actions were not only appropriate but necessary to ensure the safety and effectiveness of her unit. Morrison had heard similar arguments in dozens of previous cases. Defense counsel almost always argued that their client's actions were justified by circumstances or information that had not been fully considered by the commanding officers who had filed the charges. Sometimes these arguments had merit, but more often they represented attempts to explain away poor decision-making or failure to follow proper military procedures. However, something in Rodriguez's tone suggested that Chen's case might be different. The defense attorney spoke with the confidence of someone who believed he had strong evidence to support his client's position, rather than the careful hedging that Morrison had come to associate with weaker cases. As the hearing moved into its next phase, Morrison prepared to listen to testimony from the various witnesses who had been present during the training exercise. Major Thompson would present his version of events. Soldiers from Chen's unit would describe what they had observed, and other officers who had been involved in planning or supervising the exercise would provide their perspectives on what had occurred. Morrison had presided over enough disciplinary hearings to know that the truth usually emerged gradually through the accumulation of testimony and evidence rather than any single dramatic revelation. He expected that by the end of the day, he would have a clear understanding of what had happened during the training exercise and whether Chen's actions warranted the disciplinary measures that Major Thompson was requesting. What Morrison did not expect was that his own assumptions about military service, leadership, and the nature of courage were about to be fundamentally challenged. He had no way of knowing that Lieutenant Chun carried with her a story of service and sacrifice that would force him to reconsider everything he thought he understood about what it meant to be a soldier. The morning sun continued to stream through the conference room windows as Morrison called for Major Thompson to present his testimony. Outside, Fort Harrison continued its daily routine of training exercises, administrative duties, and the thousand small tasks that kept a military installation functioning. Inside Conference Room B, however, a story was about to unfold that would reveal the extraordinary depths of character that could exist behind the most ordinary appearances. Morrison adjusted his reading glasses and opened his notebook to a fresh page, ready to record the details of what he expected to be a routine disciplinary matter. He had no idea that within a few hours, his understanding of military service would be forever changed by a young lieutenant whose scars told a story that was far more complex and compelling than any official report could ever capture. Major Robert Thompson stood at attention as Colonel Morrison called him to testify. At 41, Thompson embodied the military ideal that Morrison himself had strived to achieve throughout his career. Thompson was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of commanding presence that made soldiers naturally want to follow his lead. His uniform was pristine, his bearing confident, and his record of service impressive by any measure. Thompson had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, earning a Bronze Star for his leadership during a particularly difficult mission outside Kandahar. He had been stationed at Fort Harrison for 3 years, serving as the officer in charge of advanced tactical training for newly assigned lieutenants and captains. His responsibilities included designing and overseeing training exercises that would prepare junior officers for the realities of modern military operations. As Thompson began his testimony, Morrison noted the clear, authoritative tone that had undoubtedly served him well in leadership positions. Thompson spoke with the confidence of someone who had faced life and death decisions in actual combat, and had learned to trust his judgment even when circumstances were uncertain or dangerous. "Colonel Morrison," Thompson began, "the incident in question occurred during Exercise Red Storm, a 3-day urban combat simulation that I designed to test the tactical decision-making abilities of our junior officers. Lieutenant Chun was assigned to lead Alpha Squad through a series of objectives that would simulate the kind of complex urban environment that our forces encounter in overseas operations." Thompson explained that Exercise Red Storm had been planned for 6 months, with detailed maps, safety protocols, and specific learning objectives that had been reviewed and approved by the base commander. The exercise involved multiple units operating simultaneously in different areas of the training facility, with careful coordination required to ensure that all participants could achieve their objectives without interference or safety complications. "The route that I assigned to Lieutenant Chen's unit," Thompson continued, "was specifically chosen to expose her soldiers to the kind of tactical challenges they might face in an actual urban combat situation. The route required them to move through narrow passages, around potential ambush points, and past civilian role players who were acting as non-combatants in a hostile environment." Morrison made notes as Thompson described the careful planning that had gone into the exercise. It was clear that significant thought and resources had been invested in creating a realistic training scenario that would provide valuable experience for the participating soldiers. Thompson's version of the events that followed painted a picture of an inexperienced officer who had become overwhelmed by the complexity of her assigned mission. According to his account, Chun had initially received her orders without any indication of concern or confusion. She had asked a few routine questions about timing and coordination with other units, but nothing that suggested she had serious reservations about the planned approach. When Lieutenant Chen's unit reached the initial checkpoint, Thompson testified, "I was monitoring their progress from the command post via radio communication and through observers positioned throughout the training area. Chun acknowledged that she had reached the checkpoint on schedule, and I confirmed that she was clear to proceed along the designated route toward Objective Alpha." What happened next, according to Thompson, represented a serious breach of military protocol and demonstrated poor judgment that could have serious implications for Chen's future effectiveness as an officer. Instead of proceeding along the planned route, Chun had apparently gathered her soldiers in a location that was not visible to the exercise observers and had spent approximately 15 minutes in what Thompson described as unauthorized consultation. When Lieutenant Chen's unit failed to appear at the next scheduled checkpoint, Thompson explained, "I attempted to contact her via radio to determine her status and location. She responded that she was making tactical adjustments based on field assessment, but refused to provide specific details about her location or intended route." Morrison frowned as he considered the implications of Thompson's testimony. Military exercises were carefully choreographed events that required precise coordination among multiple units. When one unit deviated from its assigned role, It could create confusion and potential safety hazards for everyone involved in the training. Thompson continued his account, describing his growing frustration as Chen's unit remained out of contact for extended periods and failed to appear at any of the predetermined checkpoints that had been established along the original route. Other units involved in the exercise began reporting that they had not encountered Alpha Squad at the expected times and locations, forcing Thompson to modify the training scenario to account for Chen's unauthorized deviation. Eventually, Thompson said, Lieutenant Chen's unit emerged from the training area at a location that was completely outside the designated exercise boundaries. When I questioned Chen about her decision to abandon the assigned route, she stated that she had identified what she called tactical problems with the original plan, but was unable to provide specific details about what those problems were. Morrison found himself becoming increasingly concerned about Chen's judgment as Thompson's testimony continued. Military training exercises were designed to push officers beyond their comfort zones and challenge them to make difficult decisions under pressure, but they were also structured environments with specific safety protocols and learning objectives. An officer who simply abandoned an assigned mission without clear justification was demonstrating exactly the kind of independent thinking that could prove disastrous in actual combat situations. Thompson's description of his post-exercise debriefing with Chun suggested an officer who was defensive about her decisions and unwilling to acknowledge that she had made serious errors in judgment. According to Thompson, Chen had maintained that her actions had been tactically sound but had been unable to provide specific explanations for why the carefully planned route had been inappropriate or dangerous. Colonel Morrison, Thompson concluded, I have been training junior officers for over 8 years, and I have never encountered a situation where an officer simply abandoned an assigned mission without clear justification. Lieutenant Chen's actions during Exercise Red Storm demonstrated a lack of military discipline and a failure to understand the importance of following orders, even when those orders might seem difficult or uncomfortable. Morrison asked Thompson several clarifying questions about the specific details of the exercise and Chen's behavior. Had Chen raised any safety concerns before the exercise began? Had there been any indication during her previous training that she might have difficulty following complex orders? Had other officers expressed similar concerns about the designated route? Thompson's answers were consistent and professional. Chen had not raised any preliminary concerns about the exercise design. Her previous training evaluations had been satisfactory, though Thompson noted that she had sometimes displayed what he characterized as excessive caution in situations that called for aggressive tactical action. No other officers had expressed reservations about the planned routes or objectives for Exercise Red Storm. As Thompson returned to his seat, Morrison found himself forming a preliminary assessment of the case. Based on the testimony he had heard so far, it appeared that Lieutenant Chun had indeed failed to follow legitimate orders without adequate justification. Her actions had disrupted a carefully planned training exercise and had demonstrated the kind of independent decision-making that could prove problematic in actual military operations. However, Morrison's experience had taught him to reserve judgment until he had heard all the available evidence. Defense counsel had suggested that there were factors not included in Thompson's initial report, and Morrison was curious to understand what those factors might be. Captain Rodriguez stood to cross-examine Major Thompson, and Morrison immediately sensed a shift in the atmosphere of the hearing. Rodriguez's questions were polite, but probing, designed to explore aspects of the incident that Thompson's initial testimony had not addressed. Major Thompson, Rodriguez began, when you designed Exercise Red Storm, did you incorporate any intelligence about the specific combat experiences of the officers who would be participating? Thompson appeared momentarily surprised by the question. The exercise was designed to provide realistic training for all participating officers, regardless of their individual backgrounds, he replied. But you did have access to the personnel files and service records of all participants, including Lieutenant Chun. Is that correct? Yes, of course. All officers involved in training exercises are properly cleared, and their records are reviewed as part of the planning process. Rodriguez paused for a moment, consulting his notes. Major Thompson, are you aware that Lieutenant Chun served with distinction during Operation Enduring Freedom, specifically during the evacuation of Kabul in August 2021? Morrison felt a sudden shift in his understanding of the case. He had assumed from Chin's apparent youth and junior rank that she was a relatively inexperienced officer, possibly someone who had joined the military recently and was still learning to adapt to military culture and expectations. The mention of Kabul immediately changed that assessment. Thompson's answer was careful and measured. I was aware that Lieutenant Chun had overseas experience, but I did not review the specific details of her service record when planning Exercise Red Storm. Were you aware, Rodriguez continued, that Lieutenant Chun was awarded the Purple Heart for injuries sustained during a suicide bombing at Hamid Karzai International Airport? The silence in the conference room was suddenly thick with tension. Morrison felt his assumptions about the case beginning to crumble as he realized that Lieutenant Chun was not the inexperienced junior officer he had imagined. The Purple Heart was awarded to soldiers who had been wounded or killed in action, and the Kabul evacuation had been one of the most dangerous and chaotic military operations in recent memory. Thompson's response indicated that he had not been fully aware of the extent of Chin's combat experience. I knew that she had been overseas, but I was not familiar with the specific details of her service or her decorations. Rodriguez pressed forward with his questioning, gradually revealing a picture of Lieutenant Chun that was completely different from the one that Morrison had constructed based on Thompson's initial testimony. Rather than an inexperienced officer who had panicked under pressure, Chun was emerging as someone who had faced actual combat situations and had been recognized for her bravery under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Major Thompson, Rodriguez asked, when Lieutenant Chun cited tactical problems with the assigned route, did you ask her to specify what those problems were? She was unable to provide specific details, Thompson replied, but his tone had lost some of its earlier confidence. Did you ask her whether her assessment was based on similarities to situations she had encountered in actual combat? Thompson paused before answering. No, I did not ask that specific question. As Rodriguez continued his cross-examination, Morrison began to understand that there might be layers to this case that went far beyond simple insubordination. If Chun had been wounded in combat, if she had experience with actual urban warfare, if she had been recognized for bravery in one of the most dangerous military operations in recent history, then her decision to deviate from a training exercise route might have been based on knowledge and experience that Major Thompson had not adequately considered. Morrison found himself reassessing everything he had heard during the morning's testimony. Thompson was clearly a competent officer with good intentions, but it was becoming apparent that he might not have had access to all the relevant information about Chin's background when he designed the training exercise or when he interpreted her actions during the event. The cross-examination revealed other details that cast Chin's behavior in a different light. Rodriguez established that Chun had attempted to explain her tactical concerns to Thompson immediately after the exercise, but that Thompson had interpreted her explanations as defensive excuses rather than legitimate tactical assessments. The cross-examination also revealed that several of the soldiers in Chin's unit had expressed positive opinions about her leadership during the exercise, though these opinions had not been included in Thompson's initial report. As the morning session concluded, Morrison found himself looking at Lieutenant Chun with entirely new eyes. The young woman sitting across from him was not an inexperienced officer who had failed under pressure, but a combat veteran who had been wounded in service to her country and who had made decisions during a training exercise based on experience that few other officers at Fort Harrison could claim to possess. Morrison called a recess for lunch, needing time to process the information that had emerged during the morning session. As the participants filed out of the conference room, he remained seated at the table, reviewing his notes and trying to understand how his initial assessment of the case could have been so fundamentally incorrect. The afternoon session would include testimony from soldiers who had been present during the exercise, and Morrison suspected that their accounts might provide even more insight into what had actually occurred during Exercise Red Storm. More importantly, he realized that he would need to hear directly from Lieutenant Chun herself, not just about her actions during the training exercise, but about the experiences that had shaped her understanding of tactics, leadership, and survival in situations that most military personnel would never encounter. As Morrison left the conference room for lunch, he carried with him a growing awareness that the case before him was about much more than military discipline or proper adherence to training protocols. It was about the complex challenge of integrating combat veterans back into routine military operations, about the difficulty of communicating hard-won tactical knowledge to officers who had never faced life and death situations, and about the assumptions that even experienced military leaders could make when they failed to look beneath the surface of formal reports and standard procedures. The afternoon would bring more testimony, more revelations, and ultimately a confrontation with truths that would challenge everything Morrison thought he knew about courage, leadership, and the true meaning of military service. The afternoon session began with a subtle change in atmosphere that Colonel Morrison could feel, but couldn't quite define. The morning's revelations about Lieutenant Chin's combat experience had shifted the fundamental nature of the case, transforming it from a simple disciplinary matter into something far more complex and significant. As he reviewed his notes during the lunch break, Morrison had found himself questioning not just his initial assumptions about Chun, but his broader understanding of how combat experience translated into military leadership and decision-making. The first witness called for the afternoon session was Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, a 26-year-old soldier who had been serving in Lieutenant Chin's squad during Exercise Red Storm. Santos was a career soldier with 8 years of military experience, including one deployment to Iraq and extensive training in urban combat tactics. Her record indicated that she was a reliable and observant non-commissioned officer with a reputation for honest and accurate reporting. As Santos took her place at the witness table, Morrison noted her professional bearing and the careful attention she paid to proper military protocol. She appeared calm, but alert, suggesting someone who took seriously the responsibility of providing testimony that could significantly impact an officer's career. Captain Williams began his questioning by establishing Santos's presence during the exercise and her position within Chin's unit. Santos confirmed that she had been designated as the squad's senior non-commissioned officer and had been responsible for ensuring that the enlisted soldiers under Chin's command followed proper procedures and maintained appropriate safety protocols throughout the training scenario. Sergeant Santos, Williams asked, please describe Lieutenant Chin's behavior when she received her initial orders from Major Thompson. Santos's response was measured and professional. Sir, Lieutenant Chun received the orders in standard fashion. She acknowledged the mission parameters, asked several questions about timing and coordination, and briefed the squad on our objectives and route. Her conduct was entirely professional and consistent with proper military protocol. Williams continued his questioning, focusing on the moment when Chun had decided to deviate from the assigned route. According to Santos, the unit had been moving through the training area according to plan when Chun had called a halt approximately halfway to their first objective. Lieutenant Chun gathered the leadership team, Santos explained, which included myself and Corporal Johnson, the team leader. She explained that she had identified what she believed were significant tactical problems with the assigned route and wanted our input before proceeding. Morrison found himself taking detailed notes as Santos described Chin's decision-making process. Rather than acting unilaterally, Chin had apparently consulted with her subordinates and had explained her tactical concerns in detail. This painted a very different picture from Thompson's testimony, which had suggested that Chun had simply abandoned her mission without adequate justification. What specific concerns did Lieutenant Chun express about the original route? Williams asked. Santos paused before responding, choosing her words carefully. Sir, Lieutenant Chun pointed out that the assigned route would require us to move through several areas that she characterized as having poor visibility and limited options for cover if we encounter hostile contact. She was particularly concerned about a section of the route that required movement through what she called a fatal funnel, where the squad would be exposed to potential fire from multiple directions with no realistic escape routes. Morrison felt a chill as he realized the implications of Santos's testimony. Chen had not abandoned her mission out of fear or inexperience, but had made a tactical assessment based on what appeared to be sophisticated understanding of urban combat vulnerabilities. The term fatal funnel was not something that would be used by an inexperienced officer, but represented advanced tactical thinking about the kinds of situations that could result in catastrophic casualties for military units operating in hostile urban environments. Williams pressed Santos for more details about Chen's alternative route and the rationale behind her decision. Santos explained that Chen had led the unit along a path that avoided the most vulnerable areas of the original route while still achieving the exercise objectives. The alternative approach had taken longer and had required more complex navigation, but had maintained what Santos described as superior tactical positioning throughout the movement. Sergeant Santos, Williams asked, in your professional opinion, did Lieutenant Chen's decision to change the route demonstrate poor military judgment? Santos's answer was immediate and emphatic. No, sir. In my opinion, Lieutenant Chen's tactical assessment was sound, and her alternative route was superior to the original plan. If we had been operating in an actual combat environment, I believe her decisions would have significantly reduced the risk of casualties while still accomplishing the mission. Morrison found himself struggling to reconcile Santos's testimony with the charges that had been brought against Chen. If an experienced, non-commissioned officer believed that Chen's tactical decisions had been appropriate and professional, then the case was becoming much more complicated than Thompson's initial report had suggested. Captain Rodriguez's cross-examination of Santos revealed additional details that further supported Chen's actions. Rodriguez established that Santos had served in actual combat environments and was qualified to assess the tactical soundness of Chen's decisions. He also revealed that Chen had attempted to communicate her tactical concerns to Major Thompson via radio, but that Thompson had ordered her to proceed along the original route without discussing the specific problems that Chen had identified. Sergeant Santos, Rodriguez asked, based on your experience in actual combat situations, do you believe that Lieutenant Chen's tactical concerns about the original route were legitimate? Yes, sir, absolutely, Santos replied without hesitation. The route that Major Thompson had planned would have exposed our unit to unnecessary risks that could have been avoided through better tactical planning. Rodriguez continued his questioning, gradually building a picture of Chen as a competent and thoughtful leader who had made difficult decisions based on sound tactical reasoning rather than fear or inexperience. Santos testified that throughout the exercise, Chen had maintained excellent communication with her soldiers, had ensured that proper safety protocols were followed, and had demonstrated the kind of battlefield awareness that Santos associated with experienced combat leaders. The next witness was Corporal David Johnson, the 23-year-old team leader who had been part of Chen's leadership consultation when she decided to change the route. Johnson was less experienced than Santos, with only 3 years of military service and no combat deployments, but his testimony provided another perspective on Chen's decision-making process and leadership style. Johnson confirmed Santos's account of Chen's tactical concerns and described her consultation process as thorough and professional. According to Johnson, Chen had not simply announced her decision to change routes, but had explained her reasoning in detail and had solicited input from both Santos and Johnson before making her final decision. Corporal Johnson, Captain Williams asked, did you agree with Lieutenant Chen's assessment that the original route posed tactical problems? Johnson's response revealed his relative inexperience, but also his respect for Chen's leadership. Sir, I don't have enough experience to judge whether Lieutenant Chen's tactical assessment was correct, but I can say that her explanations made sense to me and that she seemed very confident about her reasoning. She also made it clear that she was taking responsibility for the decision and that any consequences would be hers to face. Rodriguez's cross-examination of Johnson focused on Chen's leadership style and the confidence that her soldiers had in her decision-making abilities. Johnson testified that throughout his time serving under Chun, he had observed her to be a thoughtful and competent leader who took seriously her responsibility for the welfare of the soldiers under her command. Corporal Johnson, Rodriguez asked, "In your opinion, did Lieutenant Chin's actions during Exercise Red Storm demonstrate good or poor leadership?" "Good leadership, sir," Johnson replied without hesitation. Lieutenant Chun explained her reasoning clearly, consulted with her subordinates, took responsibility for her decisions, and made sure that everyone understood their roles and responsibilities. She also made it clear that the safety of the squad was her primary concern, even if that meant accepting potential criticism for changing the exercise plan. As the afternoon progressed, Morrison heard testimony from several other soldiers who had been present during Exercise Red Storm. Their accounts were remarkably consistent, painting a picture of Lieutenant Chun as a competent and thoughtful leader who had made difficult tactical decisions based on legitimate concerns about the safety and effectiveness of her unit. Perhaps most significantly, none of the enlisted soldiers who testified expressed any criticism of Chin's leadership or decision-making during the exercise. Several specifically mentioned that they had confidence in her tactical abilities and that they believe her decisions had been based on superior understanding of urban combat principles. The final witness of the afternoon was Captain Lisa Armstrong, a military intelligence officer who had been responsible for providing scenario background and threat assessments for Exercise Red Storm. Armstrong's testimony provided crucial context about the training environment and the specific challenges that Chin's unit had been expected to encounter. According to Armstrong, the exercise had been designed to simulate an extremely hostile urban environment with multiple potential threat vectors and limited opportunities for tactical maneuvering. The scenario was intentionally challenging, designed to push participating officers beyond their comfort zones and force them to make difficult decisions under pressure. Captain Armstrong, Rodriguez asked during his examination, "In your professional assessment, would the route originally assigned to Lieutenant Chin's unit have exposed them to significant tactical vulnerabilities?" Armstrong paused before responding, clearly aware of the implications of her answer. The original route was designed to be challenging, but upon reflection, I believe that some sections of the planned movement did expose the unit to potential vulnerabilities that could have been problematic in an actual combat environment. Rodriguez pressed for more specific details. "Can you elaborate on those vulnerabilities?" The route included several choke points where the unit would have been forced to move through areas with limited visibility and restricted options for cover or concealment. In an actual combat situation, these areas could have presented significant risks for the unit. Armstrong's testimony provided expert validation for Chin's tactical concerns and suggested that her decision to modify the route had been based on legitimate military considerations rather than poor judgment or fear. As the afternoon session concluded, Morrison found his understanding of the case completely transformed. What had begun as an apparent case of insubordination and poor judgment had evolved into a complex situation involving an experienced combat veteran who had made sophisticated tactical decisions based on hard-won battlefield experience. The testimony from multiple witnesses had consistently supported Chin's version of events and had suggested that her actions during Exercise Red Storm had demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical thinking and leadership that the military sought to develop in its officers. Rather than a failure of military discipline, Chin's decisions appeared to represent the application of combat experience to a training scenario in ways that had improved both safety and tactical effectiveness. Morrison realized that he was facing a fundamental challenge to his assumptions about military training, leadership development, and the integration of combat veterans into routine military operations. The case had raised questions about whether traditional training exercises adequately accounted for the advanced tactical knowledge that combat veterans brought to military units, and whether commanding officers always had access to the information they needed to properly assess the decisions made by subordinates with extensive combat experience. As the participants prepared to leave the conference room for the day, Morrison knew that the most critical testimony was yet to come. The following morning would bring Lieutenant Chin's opportunity to tell her own story, to explain her actions in her own words, and to provide the full context that would allow Morrison to understand not just what had happened during Exercise Red Storm, but why it had happened and what it revealed about the complex challenges of military leadership in an era when many junior officers possessed combat experience that exceeded that of their immediate supervisors. Morrison gathered his notes and prepared to spend the evening reviewing everything he had learned during the day's testimony. He knew that the decisions he would make at the conclusion of a hearing would have implications that extended far beyond Lieutenant Chen's individual case, potentially affecting how the military approached training, leadership development, and the integration of combat veterans into military units throughout the service. The evening would provide time for reflection and analysis, but Morrison suspected that the most challenging aspects of the case were still ahead of him. The morning would bring Chen's testimony, and with it, the opportunity to understand the full story behind the decisions that had led to this disciplinary hearing and the experiences that had shaped one young officer's approach to military leadership and tactical decision-making. The second morning of the hearing dawned gray and overcast, with heavy clouds that seemed to mirror the weight of anticipation hanging over Conference Room B. Colonel Morrison arrived earlier than usual, using the extra time to review his notes from the previous day's testimony, and to prepare for what he knew would be the most critical phase of the proceedings. Morrison had spent much of the previous evening thinking about the case, trying to reconcile the conflicting narratives that had emerged during the first day of testimony. Major Thompson's account had portrayed Lieutenant Chen as an inexperienced officer who had failed under pressure, but the testimony from the enlisted soldiers and Captain Armstrong had painted a completely different picture of a competent leader making sophisticated tactical decisions based on legitimate concerns. The key to resolving these contradictions lay with Chen herself. Her testimony would provide the opportunity to understand not just what she had done during Exercise Red Storm, but why she had done it and what experiences had shaped her decision-making process. Morrison knew that her account would be crucial in determining whether the charges against her were justified or whether she had been unfairly accused of insubordination when she had actually demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical thinking that the military sought to develop in its officers. When Lieutenant Chen entered the conference room that morning, Morrison found himself observing her with entirely new awareness. The previous day's testimony had revealed that the young woman before him was not the inexperienced junior officer he had initially assumed, but a combat veteran who had been wounded in service to her country and who possessed tactical knowledge gained through actual battlefield experience. Chen's demeanor as she took her place at the witness table was calm and professional, but Morrison could detect subtle signs of the physical discomfort that apparently resulted from her combat injuries. She moved with slight care, favoring her left side in a way that was barely noticeable but suggested ongoing effects from whatever trauma she had experienced during her deployment. Captain Rodriguez began his direct examination by establishing Chen's military background and service record. The details that emerged painted a picture of an officer whose career had been marked by distinction and dedication from the very beginning of her military service. Chen had graduated near the top of her class from the United States Military Academy at West Point, earning a commission as a second lieutenant in 2019. Her initial training and early assignments have been exemplary, with consistently high ratings from supervising officers and recognition for leadership potential that suggested a promising military career. In early 2021, Chen had volunteered for deployment to Afghanistan as part of the ongoing military presence that was providing security and support during the planned withdrawal of American forces. Her assignment had placed her with a unit responsible for providing security at Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul, one of the most dangerous and challenging assignments available to American military personnel at that time. Lieutenant Chen, Rodriguez asked, "Can you describe your responsibilities during your deployment to Afghanistan?" Chen's response was measured and professional, but Morrison could detect undertones of emotion as she began to describe experiences that had clearly been transformative. "Sir, my unit was responsible for providing perimeter security at the airport and assisting with the evacuation of American citizens and Afghan allies. The situation was extremely chaotic, with thousands of civilians trying to leave the country and constant threats from terrorist organizations operating in the area. Rodriguez guided Chun through a description of the conditions at the airport during the evacuation period. The picture that emerged was one of almost unimaginable chaos and danger, with American military personnel working around the clock to process evacuees while defending against constant threats of terrorist attacks. The security situation was extremely fluid, Chun explained. We were dealing with massive crowds of civilians, many of whom were desperate to leave Afghanistan and were willing to take extraordinary risks to reach the evacuation flights. At the same time, we had reliable intelligence indicating that terrorist groups were planning attacks against the airport and the evacuation operations. Morrison found himself struggling to imagine the pressure and complexity of the situation that Sean was describing. The Kabul evacuation had been one of the most challenging military operations in recent memory, requiring American forces to maintain security and coordinate complex logistics while operating in an environment where the distinction between civilians and potential threats was often impossible to determine. Rodriguez's questioning gradually moved toward the specific incident that had resulted in Chin's Purple Heart decoration. As Chun began to describe the events of August 26, 2021, Morrison realized that he was about to hear an account of courage and sacrifice that would provide crucial context for understanding her actions during Exercise Red Storm. On the morning of August 26th, Chin testified, "Our intelligence indicated heightened terrorist activity in the area around the airport. We had specific warnings about potential suicide bombing attacks, but we also had thousands of civilians who were depending on us to maintain security so that the evacuation flights could continue." Chin described how her unit had been positioned near one of the main gates of the airport, where they were responsible for screening civilians and maintaining order among the crowds of people seeking to reach the evacuation flights. The situation required constant vigilance and split-second decision-making, as soldiers had to balance security concerns with humanitarian responsibilities. At approximately 1800 hours, Chun continued, "I observed an individual in the crowd whose behavior was inconsistent with that of the other civilians. He was moving against the flow of people trying to reach the gate, and he appeared to be carrying something concealed under his clothing." Morrison felt a chill as he realized that Chun was describing the moments leading up to what had apparently been a terrorist attack. The calm, professional tone with which she recounted these events made them even more powerful, suggesting someone who had learned to compartmentalize traumatic experiences in order to function effectively in military environments. Chun explained that she had attempted to alert other members of her unit while moving to intercept the suspicious individual. However, the crowded conditions and high noise levels in the area had made communication difficult, and she had been forced to make immediate tactical decisions without the full support of her unit. When the individual reached a position where he posed an immediate threat to civilians and military personnel, Chun testified, "I moved to intercept him. As I approached, he detonated an explosive device that he had been carrying. The explosion," Chin explained, "had killed 13 American service members and over 170 Afghan civilians. Chin herself had been severely wounded, suffering multiple shrapnel injuries that had required extensive medical treatment and months of rehabilitation." Morrison felt his throat tighten as he began to understand the full scope of what Chun had experienced. The young woman sitting before him had not only survived one of the deadliest attacks on American forces in recent years, but had apparently taken action to prevent even greater casualties by intercepting the suicide bomber before he could reach a more crowded area. Rodriguez continued his questioning, establishing that Chin's actions during the attack had been recognized with the Purple Heart for her injuries and the Bronze Star for her heroic conduct in attempting to prevent the bombing. The citations for her decorations described her as having displayed exceptional courage and devotion to duty in the face of extreme danger. As Chun described her recovery and rehabilitation process, Morrison began to understand the physical and emotional challenges that she had overcome to return to active duty. Her injuries had required multiple surgeries and extensive physical therapy, but she had been determined to continue her military career and to return to duties that would allow her to serve her country effectively. Lieutenant Chun, Rodriguez asked, "How did your experiences in Afghanistan affect your approach to tactical planning and risk assessment?" Chin's response was thoughtful and measured. "Sir, my combat experience taught me to identify and assess threats that might not be apparent to personnel who have not operated in hostile environments. I learned to recognize tactical vulnerabilities and to prioritize the safety of personnel under my command, even when that required making difficult decisions about operational procedures." Morrison realized that Chin's answer provided crucial context for understanding her actions during Exercise Red Storm. Rather than demonstrating poor judgment or insubordination, her decision to modify the training exercise route had apparently been based on sophisticated tactical knowledge gained through actual combat experience and a heightened awareness of the kinds of vulnerabilities that could result in casualties. Rodriguez's examination continued with detailed questions about Chin's tactical assessment during Exercise Red Storm. Chin explained that when she had reviewed the assigned route, she had immediately recognized several features that reminded her of the tactical situation at Kabul Airport, particularly the choke points and limited escape routes that could become fatal traps if hostile contact occurred. "When I observed the route that Major Thompson had planned," Chin testified, "I recognized tactical vulnerabilities that were similar to those present at the airport in Kabul. The route required movement through areas with limited visibility and restricted options for cover or concealment, exactly the kind of tactical situation that had proven so dangerous during my deployment." Chin described her decision-making process during the exercise, emphasizing that she had not acted unilaterally, but had consulted with her non-commissioned officers and had attempted to communicate her concerns to Major Thompson. When Thompson had ordered her to proceed along the original route without addressing her tactical concerns, she had been forced to choose between following orders that she believed could result in unnecessary risks to her soldiers or taking responsibility for modifying the plan to ensure their safety. "Lieutenant Chun," Rodriguez asked, "why did you not provide more detailed explanations of your tactical concerns to Major Thompson during the exercise?" Chun paused before responding, and Morrison could see that she was choosing her words carefully. "Sir, in my experience, detailed tactical discussions during active operations can be dangerous and time-consuming. I attempted to communicate my concerns as clearly as possible given the time constraints of the exercise, but Major Thompson did not seem interested in discussing the specific tactical problems I had identified." Morrison found himself frustrated with Major Thompson's failure to take advantage of Chin's combat experience during the planning and execution of the training exercise. Rather than viewing her tactical concerns as insubordination, Thompson should have recognized them as valuable input from an officer with actual battlefield experience that could improve the realism and effectiveness of the training scenario. Captain Williams began his cross-examination by challenging Chin's characterization of her communications with Major Thompson and questioning whether her tactical concerns had been as clearly communicated as she claimed. However, Chin's responses were consistent and professional, demonstrating that she had made appropriate efforts to communicate her concerns while also fulfilling her responsibilities as a unit leader. Williams also attempted to suggest that Chin's combat experience had made her overly cautious and unsuited for routine training exercises. This line of questioning backfired when Chun explained that her combat experience had actually enhanced her ability to assess tactical situations realistically and to make decisions that balanced operational requirements with personnel safety. "Captain Williams," Chin responded, "my combat experience taught me that tactical planning should always account for worst-case scenarios and should prioritize the safety of personnel while still accomplishing the mission. The decisions I made during Exercise Red Storm were consistent with those principles." As Chin's testimony continued, Morrison realized that the case had become about much more than a single disciplinary incident. It raised fundamental questions about how the military integrated combat veterans into routine operations, whether training exercises adequately prepared officers for the realities of modern warfare, and how commanding officers should respond when subordinates possess tactical knowledge that exceeded their own. Chin's final responses to questioning demonstrated her continued commitment to military service and her desire to use her combat experience to improve training and operational effectiveness throughout the military. Rather than someone who had been traumatized by combat and was unable to function effectively in military environments, she emerged as an officer who had been strengthened by her experiences and who possessed valuable knowledge that could benefit other military personnel. As Chun concluded her testimony and returned to her seat, Morrison found himself facing the most difficult decision of his military career. The evidence clearly indicated that Chun had not been guilty of insubordination or poor judgment, but had made sophisticated tactical decisions based on combat experience that Major Thompson had failed to recognize or appreciate. The case had revealed serious problems with the way the military approached training exercises and the integration of combat veterans into routine military operations. More broadly, it had demonstrated the dangers of making assumptions about military personnel based on rank, age, or appearance, without taking into account the full scope of their experience and capabilities. Morrison knew that his decision would have implications that extended far beyond Lieutenant Chen's individual case. It would send a message about how the military valued combat experience, how it approached training and professional development, and whether it was truly committed to learning from the hard-won knowledge of veterans who had served in actual combat situations. The final phase of the hearing would require Morrison to synthesize everything he had learned and to render a decision that was both fair to Lieutenant Chun and beneficial to the broader interests of military effectiveness and professional development. The weight of that responsibility sat heavily on his shoulders as he prepared to bring the formal hearing to a close and to begin the process of determining how justice could best be served in this complex and challenging case. Colonel Morrison called a 30-minute recess following Lieutenant Chen's testimony, needing time to process the weight of what he had heard and to prepare for the closing arguments that would conclude the formal hearing. As the conference room emptied, he remained seated at the head of the table, staring at the notes he had accumulated over 2 days of testimony that had fundamentally challenged his understanding of military leadership, combat experience, and the nature of courage itself. The silence in the empty room felt heavy with the gravity of the decision that lay before him. Morrison had presided over dozens of disciplinary hearings during his career, but none had forced him to confront such complex questions about the nature of military service and the value of combat experience. The case had evolved from what appeared to be a straightforward matter of insubordination into a profound examination of how the military integrated veterans with actual battlefield experience into routine operations and training exercises. Morrison found himself thinking about his own military career and the assumptions he had carried throughout his 3 decades of service. He had always prided himself on being fair and objective in his assessments of military personnel, but the Chen case had revealed blind spots in his thinking that he had never recognized. His initial assumption that Chun was an inexperienced junior officer had colored his interpretation of the charges against her, leading him to accept Major Thompson's characterization of her actions without adequately considering alternative explanations. The testimony from Chun and the enlisted personnel had painted a completely different picture of the events during Exercise Red Storm. Rather than an officer who had panicked under pressure or failed to follow legitimate orders, Chun had emerged as someone who had applied sophisticated tactical knowledge gained through actual combat experience to improve the safety and effectiveness of a training exercise. Her decision to modify the assigned route had not been an act of insubordination, but a demonstration of exactly the kind of battlefield awareness and tactical thinking that the military sought to develop in its officers. Morrison realized that Major Thompson, despite his good intentions and professional competence, had made the same error that Morrison himself had initially made. Thompson had assessed Chen's actions based on assumptions about her experience level and capabilities without taking into account the combat knowledge that she had gained through her deployment to Afghanistan. Thompson's failure to recognize the value of Chin's tactical concerns had resulted in a disciplinary action that was not only unjust, but potentially harmful to military effectiveness and professional development. As Morrison reviewed his notes, he was struck by the consistency of the testimony that had supported Chin's version of events. Every enlisted soldier who had testified had expressed confidence in Chin's leadership and tactical decisions. Sergeant Santos, an experienced non-commissioned officer with combat experience, had explicitly stated that Chin's tactical assessment had been sound and that her alternative route had been superior to the original plan. Captain Armstrong, the intelligence officer who had helped design the exercise, had acknowledged that the original route had included tactical vulnerabilities that Chun had correctly identified. Perhaps most significantly, Chin's own testimony had revealed the depth of experience and knowledge that she brought to military operations. Her account of the Kabul airport bombing had demonstrated not only remarkable courage under extreme circumstances, but also the kind of tactical awareness that came from operating in genuinely hostile environments where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death for military personnel and civilians alike. Morrison found himself grappling with broader questions about military training and professional development that the case had raised. How should the military incorporate the tactical knowledge of combat veterans into training exercises? How should commanding officers assess and respond to input from subordinates who possessed battlefield experience that exceeded their own? What was the appropriate balance between military discipline and tactical flexibility when experienced officers identified potential problems with operational plans? These were not simple questions with easy answers, but Morrison recognized that his decision in Chin's case would send important signals about how the military valued combat experience and whether it was truly committed to learning from the hard-won knowledge of veterans who had served in actual combat situations. When a hearing reconvened, Captain Williams presented his closing argument on behalf of the prosecution. Williams acknowledged that the testimony had revealed complexities in the case that had not been apparent from the initial reports, but he maintained that Chin's actions during Exercise Red Storm had constituted a violation of military discipline that warranted corrective action. Colonel Morrison, Williams argued, while Lieutenant Chin's combat experience and tactical knowledge are certainly commendable, they do not excuse her failure to follow direct orders during a training exercise. Military effectiveness depends on a clear chain of command and the expectation that orders will be followed promptly and completely. Regardless of Lieutenant Chin's personal assessment of the tactical situation, she was obligated to follow Major Thompson's instructions and to raise any concerns through proper channels after the exercise was completed. Williams emphasized that allowing subordinate officers to modify or ignore orders based on their individual tactical assessments could lead to chaos and confusion in military operations. He argued that Chun should have followed the assigned route during the exercise and then presented her tactical concerns to Major Thompson through appropriate channels afterward. Morrison found Williams's argument technically correct, but incomplete in its consideration of the full context of the case. While military discipline was indeed essential for effective operations, the argument failed to address the question of whether Thompson's orders had been tactically sound or whether Chin's modifications had actually improved the exercise rather than undermining it. Captain Rodriguez's closing argument presented a fundamentally different interpretation of the case and its implications for military effectiveness and professional development. Rodriguez argued that Chin's actions during Exercise Red Storm had demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical thinking and leadership initiative that the military needed to develop in its officers. Colonel Morrison, Rodriguez said, Lieutenant Chun did not fail to follow orders out of insubordination or poor judgment. She made sophisticated tactical decisions based on combat experience that few officers in the military possess. Her modifications to the exercise route improved both safety and tactical effectiveness while still accomplishing the training objectives. Rather than being disciplined for her actions, Lieutenant Chun should be recognized for applying valuable battlefield knowledge to improve military training. Rodriguez emphasized that Chun had made appropriate efforts to communicate her tactical concerns to Major Thompson and that she had consulted with her subordinates before making her final decisions. He argued that Chen's actions had demonstrated leadership qualities that were essential for effective military operations, particularly the willingness to take responsibility for difficult decisions when the safety and effectiveness of military personnel were at stake. The evidence in this case demonstrates that Lieutenant Chun possesses tactical knowledge and leadership capabilities that are invaluable assets to the military, Rodriguez continued. Disciplining her for applying this knowledge would send a dangerous message to other combat veterans about whether their experience is valued and whether they are encouraged to contribute their expertise to improve military operations. Rodriguez concluded by arguing that the case represented an opportunity for the military to demonstrate its commitment to learning from combat experience and to improving training exercises by incorporating the tactical knowledge of veterans who had served in actual battlefield conditions. As the closing arguments concluded, Morrison found himself facing a decision that would require him to balance multiple competing considerations. The technical question of whether Chun had violated military protocol by modifying her assigned route was relatively straightforward, but the broader questions about the value of combat experience and the effectiveness of military training were far more complex. Morrison announced that he would render his decision after a brief deliberation period. As the participants waited in the conference room, he stepped into an adjacent office to consider the evidence and to determine how best to serve both the interests of military discipline and the broader goals of military effectiveness and professional development. Morrison's deliberation process forced him to confront his own assumptions about military leadership and the nature of battlefield experience. He realized that his initial assessment of the case had been shaped by biases and preconceptions that had prevented him from recognizing the true nature of Chen's capabilities and the value of her tactical knowledge. The evidence clearly indicated that Chun had not acted out of insubordination or poor judgment, but had made sophisticated tactical decisions based on combat experience that had actually improved the training exercise. Her actions had demonstrated leadership qualities that were essential for effective military operations, and disciplining her would send exactly the wrong message about how the military valued combat experience and tactical expertise. However, Morrison also recognized that completely exonerating Chun without addressing the procedural issues raised by the case could create problems for military discipline and chain of command. The challenge was to find a resolution that recognized the value of Chen's tactical knowledge while also maintaining appropriate standards for military protocol and communication. When Morrison returned to the conference room to announce his decision, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Everyone present understood that the outcome would have implications that extended far beyond Chen's individual case, affecting how the military approached training exercises, professional development, and the integration of combat veterans into routine operations. Morrison began by acknowledging the complexity of the case and the valuable testimony that had been provided by all participants. He then addressed the specific charges against Chun, explaining his reasoning for each decision and the broader principles that had guided his analysis. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented during this hearing, Morrison announced, "I find that Lieutenant Chen's actions during Exercise Red Storm were based on legitimate tactical concerns and demonstrated appropriate application of combat experience to improve training effectiveness and personnel safety." Morrison continued by explaining that while Chun could have communicated her concerns more clearly to Major Thompson, the evidence indicated that she had made appropriate efforts to explain her tactical assessment within the constraints of the training exercise. He noted that Thompson's failure to adequately consider Chen's input had contributed to the misunderstanding that had led to the disciplinary charges. The charges of willful disobedience and conduct unbecoming an officer are dismissed, Morrison stated. Lieutenant Chen's actions demonstrated sound tactical judgment and appropriate leadership initiative. Rather than representing failures of military discipline, her decisions during Exercise Red Storm exemplified the kind of battlefield awareness and tactical thinking that the military seeks to develop in its officers. Morrison went on to address the broader implications of the case, emphasizing the need for military training exercises to better incorporate the tactical knowledge of combat veterans and for commanding officers to recognize and value the expertise that experienced personnel brought to military operations. This case has highlighted important opportunities for the military to improve its training programs and professional development processes, Morrison explained. Lieutenant Chin's combat experience represents a valuable resource that should be utilized to enhance training effectiveness and to prepare other officers for the realities of modern military operations. Morrison concluded by recommending that Chun be assigned to a position where her tactical expertise could be used to improve training programs and that Major Thompson receive additional training on incorporating combat veteran perspectives into exercise planning and execution. As Morrison finished reading his decision, he looked directly at Lieutenant Chun for the first time since the hearing had begun. What he saw in her eyes was not relief or gratitude, but a quiet dignity and strength that spoke to experiences and sacrifices that transcended anything that could be captured in official reports or formal proceedings. Chun stood and saluted, her military bearing impeccable despite the physical challenges that her combat injuries continued to present. As she prepared to leave the conference room, Morrison realized that his scoff at her initial appearance 2 days earlier had represented exactly the kind of superficial judgment that prevented military leaders from recognizing the extraordinary capabilities that could exist behind the most ordinary appearances. The scars that Chin carried, both visible and invisible, told a story of service and sacrifice that commanded respect rather than dismissal. Morrison's decision had not only vindicated Chin's actions during Exercise Red Storm, but had also challenged the military to better recognize and utilize the tactical knowledge that combat veterans brought to all aspects of military service. As the participants filed out of Conference Room B, Morrison remained seated, reflecting on the lessons that the case had taught him about courage, leadership, and the true meaning of military service. He had learned that sometimes the most profound acts of bravery occurred not on distant battlefields, but in quiet conference rooms where individuals had the courage to stand up for their principles and to apply their hard-won knowledge in service of their fellow soldiers. The Chin case would become a turning point in Morrison's own understanding of military leadership and would influence his approach to personnel management and professional development for the remainder of his career. More importantly, it would serve as a reminder that every soldier carried unique experiences and capabilities that deserved recognition and respect regardless of rank, age, or appearance. In the end, the Colonel's scoff had given way to profound respect, and Chin's scars had indeed said more than words ever could about the nature of courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of serving one's country with honor and distinction.